Imagine you run the most powerful country on earth. You don't need to invade anyone. You don't need to drop a single bomb. All you have to do is make a phone call, and suddenly, another country can't buy oil, can't use the global banking system, can't even import medicine. That's the power of sanctions. And for the last 80 years, one country has used this weapon more than any other nation in history by a massive margin. The United States has sanctioned over 20 countries, thousands of individuals, and hundreds of companies, all at the same time. Right now, as you're watching this video, there are active U.S. sanctions programs running against Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, Cuba, Venezuela, Syria, Myanmar, and many more. For a long time, it worked. Countries bowed, economies broke, leaders negotiated. The threat of being cut off from the U.S.-dominated financial system was enough to change behavior. But something has shifted, and the people paying the closest attention, economists, diplomats, even some inside Washington, are starting to ask a very uncomfortable question. Are American sanctions actually working anymore? Or has the U.S. overplayed its hand so badly that it's now accelerating the very thing it was trying to prevent? Before we get into the drama, let's be clear about what we're actually talking about, because sanctions is one of those words that gets thrown around constantly, but most people don't really understand the mechanics. At the most basic level, a sanction is an economic penalty. You're telling a country, a company, or a person, you can't do business with us, you can't access our financial system, and if anyone else does business with you and also wants access to our system, they're punished too. That last part is called secondary sanctions, and it's one of the most aggressive tools in the American arsenal. It basically says, even if you're not American, and this doesn't involve American territory, if you trade with the sanctioned party, we'll come after you too. Think about how powerful that is. The US dollar is used in roughly 88% of all international currency transactions. Most global trade, oil, commodities, they all flow through dollar-denominated systems. SWIFT, the global banking messaging network, is deeply tied to U.S. financial infrastructure. So when America says you're out, it's not just cutting off access to the U.S. market, it's potentially cutting you off from the entire global financial architecture that America helped build after World War II. That's an extraordinary amount of structural power, and Washington has used it repeatedly, aggressively, sometimes brilliantly, and sometimes recklessly. The U.S. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, they call it OFAC, manages these programs, and OFAC has grown dramatically since 9/11. More staff, more targets, more complexity. Today, the U.S. Specially Designated Nationals List, the SDN list, contains over 15,000 names, individuals, companies, ships, aircraft, entire government agencies. If you're on that list, you are financially radioactive. No bank in the world that values its access to the U.S. system will touch you. And here's where it gets interesting. The SDN list isn't just for terrorists or rogue states. It includes Russian oligarchs, Chinese tech firms, Iranian oil companies, Venezuelan politicians, North Korean front companies operating in Southeast Asia, and even some European and Turkish entities. This is a tool that has expanded far beyond its original purpose, and the expansion has consequences. Sanctions are not new. The U.S. has used economic coercion since at least the 1800s. But the modern era, the era of truly weaponized finance, really kicks off in the 1990s and accelerates dramatically after 2001. And by the 2010s, sanctions had become Washington's go-to response for almost every geopolitical problem. Don't like what a country is doing? Sanction it. Don't like a company? Sanction it. Don't like a person? Sanction them. To be fair, sanctions have genuinely worked in certain cases. Let's look at when they've been most effective, because understanding the successes tells us a lot about why the failures are failing. The most cited success story is Iran and the 2015 nuclear deal. After years of crippling sanctions that cut Iran off from oil revenues in the global banking system, Iran came to the table and signed the JCPOA, agreeing to limit its nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief. Now, whether you think the JCPOA was a good deal or not, that's a separate debate. The point is, the sanctions worked. They created enough economic pain that a government changed its behavior. That's the textbook definition of sanctions success. The key ingredients were broad international coalition. The EU, Russia, China, and the US all participated. Clear objective: halt the nuclear program. Credible relief offer: if you comply, the pain stops. And a leadership in Tehran that was willing to negotiate. Another example: Libya in the early 2000s. Muammar Gaddafi had been under various sanctions for decades because of terrorism links, including the Lockerbie bombing. Eventually, he agreed to give up his weapons of mass destruction program, paid compensation to Lockerbie victims, and sanctions were lifted. South Africa in the 1980s is also cited. International sanctions contributed to the economic pressure that helped end apartheid. Though experts debate how decisive sanctions were compared to internal resistance movements. Serbia in the 1990s. Saddam's Iraq being pushed back from Kuwait. Myanmar's military junta making some concessions in the 2010s. These are cases where sanctions played at least a contributing role in producing some outcome. But notice a pattern in all the success stories. The target was relatively small or economically isolated to begin with. There was broad multilateral participation. It wasn't just the US acting alone. There was a specific, achievable demand, and there was some off-ramp, a way for the sanctioned party to actually comply and get relief. When those conditions aren't met, when it's unilateral, when the demand is vague or impossible, when the target has alternatives, when there's no real off-ramp, sanctions tend to fail, and fail badly. Let's talk about Cuba. The U.S. has maintained a comprehensive embargo on Cuba since 1962. 60-plus years, multiple generations of the Castro government, millions of Cubans suffering from economic deprivation, and the communist government is still there. Cuba is one of the longest-running sanction programs in history, and by any honest measure, did it achieve regime change? No. Did it fundamentally alter Cuban government behavior? Not really. Did it cause enormous suffering for ordinary Cuban people? Absolutely. The Cuban government, like many sanctioned governments, learned to use the sanctions as a political tool. Every shortage, every hardship got blamed on the American blockade. The external pressure actually helped the regime maintain internal cohesion and deflect blame. This is called the rally around the flag effect, and it's one of the most consistent findings in the academic literature on sanctions. When you squeeze a country from outside, the population often blames the outsider, not their own government. North Korea is the extreme version of this, probably the most heavily sanctioned country on Earth, almost completely cut off from the global economy. And yet, North Korea has nuclear weapons, ballistic missiles that can reach the continental United States, and a leadership that shows zero signs of changing course. The sanctions haven't stopped Pyongyang, they've just made North Korea more creative about finding workarounds and more dependent on China, which gives Beijing enormous leverage. Now let's get to the biggest and most consequential test of American sanctions power in modern history, February 2022. Russia invades Ukraine, and the West responds with what officials called the most sweeping sanctions regime ever imposed on a major economy. The scale was genuinely unprecedented. Within weeks, the US, EU, UK, Canada, Japan, Australia, and others had frozen roughly $300 billion of Russia's central bank reserves held in Western financial institutions. Russia was cut off from SWIFT. Hundreds of Russian banks, companies, and individuals were sanctioned. Western companies, including major energy firms, car manufacturers, tech companies, luxury brands, fast food chains, voluntarily exited the Russian market. The ruble initially crashed. Western economists predicted Russia's GDP would collapse by 15%, maybe more. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said the sanctions would impose severe and immediate costs on the Russian economy. The goal, implied if not always stated, was to create so much economic pain that Putin would either stop the war or be overthrown by elites who wanted their yachts and London apartments back. Here's what actually happened. Russia's economy did contract in 2022, but only by about 2.1%. In 2023, it grew by 3.6%. In 2024, despite all the sanctions, Russia's economy outperformed Germany's and most of Western Europe. The ruble stabilized. Russian unemployment hit record lows, driven by massive military spending and labor demand. The yachts got seized in European ports. The oligarchs lost their villas in France and Italy. But Putin's war continued. The front line barely moved for 2 years. Russia kept fighting. How? Several reasons, and each one tells us something important about why sanctions are losing their bite. First, China. China never joined the sanctions, and China became the buyer of last resort for Russian oil, gas, and commodities, often at steep discounts. China also became a major supplier to Russia of goods that the West cut off, including electronics, machinery, and vehicle components. Second, India. India also didn't join the sanctions. India massively ramped up purchases of discounted Russian oil, refined it, and in some cases sold the refined products back to European markets. One country's sanctions became another country's trade opportunity. Third, Turkey. Turkey is a NATO member, but Turkey didn't implement sanctions against Russia. Turkish banks continued operating. Turkish ports became transit hubs for goods entering Russia. Istanbul became a financial corridor for sanctioned Russian entities. Fourth, the UAE, particularly Dubai, became a major hub for wealthy Russians, Russian companies, and commodity traders. Russian assets flowed into Dubai's real estate market. Russian businesses restructured through UAE entities. The fundamental problem was that the sanctions coalition only included countries representing maybe 40 to 45% of the global economy. The other 55 to 60%, China, India, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, Africa, Latin America, either actively helped Russia circumvent sanctions or simply stayed neutral. This is a structural change in the world. In the 1990s, US-led coalitions represented such an overwhelming share of the global economy that being cut off from the West was devastating. In 2024, the Global South has enough economic weight that Russia had viable alternatives. Russia also adapted domestically. Military production surged. Substitute goods from non-Western suppliers filled gaps. The government controlled the economy more directly, directing resources toward war priorities. It wasn't pretty, but it functioned. There were real costs. Russian technology imports were badly disrupted. Advanced semiconductors, aviation parts, certain industrial equipment, Russia struggled to get these. Some military equipment quality declined. Consumer goods became more expensive. But here's the brutal reality. Sanctions caused Russia pain, but not enough pain to change Russian strategic behavior. The war continued at the price of continued economic strain, and Moscow decided the price was worth paying. And on the other side of the ledger, the sanctions had costs for the sanctioners too. European energy prices spiked dramatically in 2022 as the continent scrambled to replace Russian gas. Germany, Europe's largest economy, suffered an industrial crisis. Inflation across the EU was significantly worsened by the energy shock. So let's be precise about what happened with Russia. The US and allies imposed historically unprecedented sanctions. Russia absorbed the hit. The war continued. And the side effect was an energy crisis that damaged the Western economies that imposed the sanctions. That's not a win. Now let's talk about the even bigger elephant in the room, China. The U.S. has placed tariffs on Chinese goods, restricted exports of advanced semiconductors to Chinese companies, put Chinese tech giants like Huawei on the entity list, sanctioned Chinese officials over Hong Kong and Xinjiang, and restricted investment in Chinese companies. But, and this is a massive but, the U.S. has not imposed comprehensive sectoral sanctions on China the way it did on Russia or Iran, and it almost certainly cannot. Here's why. China is the second largest economy in the world and could soon be the first. China holds hundreds of billions of dollars of U.S. Treasury debt. China is the primary manufacturer for vast categories of goods that Americans buy daily: electronics, pharmaceuticals, consumer products. The two economies are so deeply intertwined that truly comprehensive sanctions on China would cause catastrophic damage to the American economy, too. It would be like trying to sanction yourself. American companies have supply chains, factories, and revenue streams in China. Apple makes most of its iPhones in China. American pharmaceutical companies source active ingredients from China. American retailers depend on Chinese manufacturing. So, what does Washington do? It does targeted actions, the semiconductor restrictions, the entity list, while maintaining the overall trade relationship. It's trying to have it both ways, compete and contain, without actually decoupling. The semiconductor restrictions are genuinely significant. Cutting China off from the most advanced chips is a real strategic blow because chips are the foundation of AI, military technology, and next generation computing. This is not trivial. But China's response has been to pour massive resources into domestic chip development. SMIC, China's leading chip manufacturer, has made surprising progress. China is not going to catch up overnight, but the gap is narrowing, and American sanctions have become one of the most powerful motivators for Chinese technological self-sufficiency. There's a term for this in geopolitics: techno-nationalism. And American sanctions are accelerating Chinese techno-nationalism at a speed that might not have happened otherwise. Think about it from Beijing's perspective. You've watched what happened to Iran, to Russia, to Huawei. You know that if relations deteriorate, the US could try to cut you off from critical technologies. So what do? You invest massively in building your own alternatives. You create redundancy. You reduce vulnerability. China's Made in China 2025 program, its push for domestic semiconductor capability, its development of alternative financial messaging systems, all of this has been turbocharged by the fear of American sanctions. And here's the irony: the more the US uses sanctions as a tool, the more it motivates targets to build the exact infrastructure that makes future sanctions less effective. Meanwhile, China is doing something that cuts right at the root of American sanctions power. It's been systematically reducing its dependence on the US dollar in international trade. China has signed dozens of bilateral currency swap agreements with countries across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Trade between China and many partners is increasingly settled in yuan. This is a slow process. The dollar is still enormously dominant, but the trajectory matters. Every percentage point that global trade shifts away from the dollar is a percentage point less power the US has to threaten financial exclusion. China is essentially playing a multi-decade game to defang the sanctions weapon, not by confronting it directly, but by building around it. This brings us to what I think is the most important structural story in global economics right now, one that most people in the West are dramatically underestimating. The entire power of American sanctions rests on dollar dominance. If you need dollars to do global business and the US controls access to dollars, then the threat of being cut off is existential. But what if you don't need dollars anymore? That's the question that governments around the world are now actively trying to answer. The freezing of Russia's central bank reserves in 2022 was a turning point, not just for Russia, but for how governments everywhere think about holding dollar-denominated assets. If the US can freeze $300 billion of a country's reserves with basically a weekend's worth of decision-making, what does that mean for everyone else? Saudi Arabia, which has maintained a dollar-pegged currency and priced oil exclusively in dollars since the 1970s, began publicly discussing yuan-denominated oil sales with China in 2002. This would have been unthinkable 5 years earlier. Brazil and China announced direct currency trade, cutting out the dollar middleman. India has been trading in rupees with more partners. ASEAN nations have been discussing local currency frameworks. The BRICS bloc, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, now joined by several others, has formally discussed creating alternative payment systems. Let's be clear, none of this replaces the dollar tomorrow. The dollar's share of global reserves is still around 58 to 60%. The euro is second at around 20%. The yuan is at roughly 2 to 3%, so the dollar is still massively dominant. But still dominant and as dominant as before are not the same thing. The dollar's share of global reserves has been declining over 2 decades, from over 70% in 2000 to around 58% today. That's a significant structural shift. And the pace of diversification efforts has accelerated sharply since 2022. Every country in the world that has any kind of complicated relationship with Washington is now thinking about how to reduce its dollar vulnerability. Here's what makes this particularly delicate for the U.S. The dollar's global role is not just a matter of American prestige, it generates real, concrete economic benefits. America can run larger deficits than any other country because there is consistent global demand for dollars as a reserve currency. This is called the exorbitant privilege. If the dollar's reserve status erodes significantly, the U.S. loses that privilege. Borrowing costs rise. The government has less fiscal flexibility. American living standards are affected. So here's the brutal irony. By using sanctions aggressively, including the weaponization of dollar-denominated financial systems, the U.S. is incentivizing the world to reduce its dependence on the very system that makes American sanctions work. It's slowly sawing off the branch it's sitting on. Former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers said something remarkable for a mainstream economist. He warned that overuse of sanctions could jeopardize the dollar's role as the world's reserve currency. This wasn't a fringe academic. This was one of the architects of American economic policy. Even within the U.S. policy establishment, there are serious people raising alarm bells. The concern isn't ideological, it's practical. You can only use a threat effectively if people believe it, and the more you use the threat, the more people find ways around it. The sanctions weapon is still powerful, but it is being gradually, systematically defanged, and the defanging is a direct consequence of how aggressively it has been used. Here's a question that almost never gets asked loudly enough in Washington. Who actually suffers when sanctions are imposed? The intended targets are governments, leaders, oligarchs, military elites. But sanctions are blunt instruments. They affect entire economies. And the people who suffer most are almost always ordinary citizens, not the leaders who made the decisions being punished. Iran is a case study in this. For most of the past 2 decades, Iranians have lived under crippling sanctions. The Iranian rial has lost over 90% of its value. Inflation has been astronomical. Access to imported medicines has been restricted. Consumer goods have been limited and expensive. The Iranian leadership, the Revolutionary Guards, they've adapted. They've built smuggling networks, alternative financial channels, relationships with sanctioned-friendly countries. The elites suffer far less than ordinary Iranians. A 2019 UN report specifically found that U.S. sanctions on Iran were having a devastating humanitarian impact, restricting access to medicine, food imports, and humanitarian aid. Not because sanctions explicitly banned these things, but because the blanket financial restrictions made banks and companies too afraid to facilitate any transactions involving Iran, even for legitimate humanitarian purposes. This is called overcompliance by the financial sector. Banks and companies, terrified of accidentally violating sanctions regulations, go far beyond what the regulations actually require. They simply stop doing any business with sanctioned countries, including the humanitarian exemptions that technically exist on paper. The result? Civilians starve. Children don't get medicine. People die from diseases that could be treated if hospitals could access the right drugs or equipment. And the government being sanctioned uses these humanitarian disasters as propaganda, pointing at American cruelty while maintaining its grip on power. Venezuela is another example. Venezuela was an oil-rich country that made catastrophic policy decisions under Hugo Chavez and Maduro. Sanctions added to the economic collapse, and today roughly 7 million Venezuelans have fled the country, one of the largest refugee crises in the Western Hemisphere, comparable in scale to the Syrian refugee crisis. Did sanctions remove Maduro? No, he's still there. Did they cause enormous suffering to millions of Venezuelans? Absolutely yes. Syria. The Assad regime survived a devastating civil war. International sanctions meant reconstruction aid couldn't flow into the country, even as millions of Syrians lived in rubble. When a massive earthquake struck Syria and Turkey in 2023, the U.S. granted a temporary sanctions waiver. essentially acknowledging that the existing regime was incompatible with basic humanitarian response. Now, some will argue these are acceptable costs, that the goal is strategic, and strategic tools sometimes have civilian casualties. This is a real position that serious people hold, but here's the policy problem. If sanctions regularly cause suffering to civilians without achieving their stated objectives, what exactly are they achieving? And what is the cost to American credibility and soft power when people in Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, Syria, people who might actually support democratic values, associate America with the economic misery in their daily lives? You can't win hearts and minds while also destroying people's purchasing power. The contradiction is real, and it matters. There's also significant academic research now showing that economic sanctions, contrary to popular belief, are associated with increased political repression inside targeted countries. Governments that feel squeezed from outside often tighten control internally. Sanctions can actually make authoritarian governments more authoritarian. If that's true, and the evidence suggests it often is, then sanctions don't just fail to achieve their goals, they actively worsen the conditions they're supposed to improve. Here's where the story gets geopolitically fascinating. Because sanctions, especially overused sanctions, don't just fail to work. They actively reshape the international order in ways that may be deeply harmful to American interests. Let's talk about what we might call the sanctions proof coalition.